Moses is one of the great characters mentioned in the Bible, and the verses that describe him the best and the ones that I love the most about him read, "And never since has a prophet like Moses arisen in Israel, whom Jehovah knew face to face. In all the signs and the wonders which Jehovah sent him to do in the land of Egypt, to Pharaoh and to all his servants, and to all his land, and in all that mighty hand, and in all the great terror which Moses showed in the eyes of all Israel." Moses lived to be 120 years old, and his life can be divided into three 40-year sections. The first 40 years were spent growing up in the courts of Pharaoh in Egypt. His second 40 years were spent tending sheep as a shepherd for his father-in-law in a desert. And then the last 40 years of Moses' life were spent as he took the children of Israel out of Egypt, out from under bondage, and was their leader and led them for 40 years through their wilderness wanderings. Some have suggested he spent 40 years learning to be somebody. Then he spent the next 40 years learning he was nobody. And the last 40 years he spent learning that God was everything. In Exodus chapter 3, it's the tail end of his second 40-year phase. He's 80 years old at the time. By the way, that's a reminder to any of us who think we're, quote, too old for ministry. I'm 63, and I don't propose or plan on living to be 120, but we should never think that because we're getting, quote, older, or maybe getting in the sunset years of our lives, that God's through with us. God can use us anytime he wants, early in our Christian life, in the middle of it, or at the end of it. Moses, it reads, kept the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian. And he led the flock to the back side of the desert, and he came to the mountain of God, to Horeb. Now this is Mount Sinai, where later Moses was to meet God face to face and was to receive the 10 Commandments from God. And the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of the midst of a thorn bush. And he looked, and behold, the thorn bush burned with fire, and the thorn bush was not burned up. We've all seen lately the views of the California fires, thousands of square miles of forest being burned, and the great flames and the plumes of smoke. And this was just one little small thorn bush in the desert, and it was burning. There was flames and smoke and heat. But the strange thing about this was it wasn't being burned up. It wasn't being consumed. And it was such an unusual phenomena that Moses had to turn aside and go investigate and see what was going on. And Moses said, I will now turn aside and see this great sight, why the thorn bush is not burned up. It's been suggested that this bush could be representative of the Israelites' condition in Egypt at that time. Oppressed by a grinding servitude, a bloody persecution, and yet in spite of the cruel policies that were bent on annihilating them as a people, they continued as numerous and thriving as ever. And the reason for this thriving was because God was in their midst. And so they say that this bush could represent the Israelites under the persecution and the heat of the persecution, and yet not being consumed, not being annihilated, because God was in the midst of them. Others have suggested maybe the bush could represent modern-day Israel. We know that there's Middle East leaders who have vowed that their purpose is to annihilate and wipe out off the planet all Jews and the whole nation of Israel today. Some have even suggested that maybe this could represent you and I, the Church of Jesus Christ, believers. There's many, many people in the world who do not like Christians at all. We go on to read, and Jehovah saw that he turned aside to see. And here's where I think that the bush could represent something a little bit different, at least for me personally. I think that it may well represent the things of the Lord in general, especially the Bible, or even things or people or events that happen in our lives that God has allowed to happen or brings about in our lives. We as Christians know the Bible is God's Word. It's profitable to teach us and to guide us and to reveal truth to us. We know that God is working in our lives and bringing things about and allowing events to happen and bringing people along our paths. And yet, many times as Christians, we don't stop, we don't turn aside, and we don't find out why and what God's doing. And it wasn't until Moses turned aside that God did speak to him. If he hadn't stopped to see what was going on and just walked on by, I don't think God would have called him. And the same is true in our lives. The things that happen in our lives that God's using and trying to get our attention with, or trying to use to guide us and give us ministry and so forth, if we don't stop and turn aside and investigate and find out why and what, we often can miss the boat, I believe. So God called to him out of the midst of the thorn bush and said, "Moses, Moses," and he said, "Here am I." God called to him, said his name 2 times, and Moses' response was, "Here I am, Lord. I'm listening. It's me." And he said, God said, "Do not come near here. Pull off your sandals from your feet, for the place on which you stand is holy ground." And he said, "I am the God of your fathers, of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob." And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look upon God. Now this was a cultural thing, showing respect, like taking off your hat today, to take off your sandals then. And it reminds me of how little respect even we as Christians have towards God these days. Anyway, Jehovah said, "I have surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt. I've heard their cry because of their taskmasters, for I know their sorrows." The seeing and hearing and knowing reminds me of another passage in the Old Testament that describes the, quote, other gods. These are idols made out of silver and gold by men and worshipped as gods. The passage I'm thinking of reads, "Their idols are silver and gold, the work of men's hands. They have mouths, but they do not speak. They have eyes, but they do not see. They have ears, but they do not hear. Noses, they don't smell. They have hands, they don't handle. They have feet, but they don't walk. They do not mutter through their throat. The ones who make them are like them, and everyone who trusts in them." And I know that not many of you, I no doubt, trust in idols, but there are things in our lives as Christians that we can look to other than God. Things such as our education, our finances, our position in life, our job, or whatever different things that we look to other than God and rely upon. And these things will fail us. These things aren't as God caring. God's not like that. God, it says that Jehovah said, "I have surely seen the affliction of my people. I've heard their cry. I know their sorrows." And then he goes on to say, "And I'm coming down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians." And here, God hears, God sees, and God cares. And God calls then Moses to service, and he says, "Now go, I'll send you to Pharaoh, that you may bring forth my people, the sons of Israel, out of Egypt." And Moses said to God, "Well, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh, and that I should bring forth the sons of Israel out of Egypt?" Right away, Moses had a question. He said, "God, who am I to do this?" And right away, God answered and said, "Well, Moses, you're the best qualified. You're the smartest. You're the strongest. You're resourceful. You're educated. You're a fast learner. You're a leader. You catch on fast. You got away with words," and blah, blah, blah. No, friends, God didn't say any of that. That's what we would say. God said, here, listen to what God said. This is key. "I will be with you. And this shall be a sign to you." And he goes on and gives him some more instructions. But see, "I will be with you." That's all we need when God calls us. It's like the little 2nd grader who was being bullied by the 5th grader. One day he went up to the 5th grader and he said, "I'm tired of your bullying me. I want you to get out of my life and no more of this." And the little 5th grader took off and ran. Unbeknownst to the 2nd grader, behind him, looking down over his head, was his father looking down at the 5th grader. And it's like that with God, with us, isn't it? God says, "I'll be with you. It's okay. And I'm what you need, not your resources, but look to me." Thanks, and I hope this has been an encouragement to you, and I'll see you next time.